Okay, let's talk about chapter 14, which is the respiratory system. This respiratory system, we've got two sections. So this is section 1. Major functions of the respiratory system provides a really large surface area for gas exchange. So the major function, one of the major functions of the respiratory system is to exchange gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air that you breathe in and the blood circulating. And that the job of the blood is to then carry those gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, to where they need to go. Oxygen to the tissue, carbon dioxide from the tissue so you can expire it at the lungs. Also to move air into and out to get to the point where gas exchange can occur. So you have to breathe air in, breathe air out. To breathe air, oxygenated air in and air with carbon dioxide out. There are several epithelial linings and some structures that are there to protect surfaces from dehydration, from temperature changes, but also to defend against pathogens. So think temperature changes, like if you go outside and go for a run and it's cold outside, you get a cough afterwards. There are some epithelial tissues that line the surfaces of the respiratory tract that protect from cold air damage, cold and dry air damage. But also think about producing sound. So think about your voice box, which is called your larynx. Not just your voice box that produces sound, but you use other structures like your lips and your tongue and your teeth to articulate that sound into words. And also you have your sense of smell. So in your nasal cavity, there are olfactory receptors that send signals about chemicals that you're breathing in to the olfactory cortex in the brain. We divide our respiratory system into two components, two parts. Upper respiratory system, which is basically everything above. Right here is your voice box, your larynx. So everything above that larynx is your upper respiratory tract. And then everything below the larynx, so here's your windpipe or the trachea, everything below that is your lower respiratory tract. And in the upper respiratory system, the job of the structures in the upper respiratory system are to filter, warm, and humidify incoming air. So air gets humidified before you breathe it in, as you breathe it in through the nasal cavity. Some of the structures in the nasal cavity help warm the air. So there's mucous membranes there that kind of keep air there, and there's structures there that keep air in the nasal cavity a little bit longer to warm it and humidify it, and also filter out some of the debris that may be breathed in from the external environment. Those three functions of the upper respiratory system structures also help protect the more sensitive lower respiratory structures. Like down here in your lungs, there's little tiny sacs of air called alveoli that need to be protected. So everything that the air that is being breathed in the upper respiratory system is filtered and warmed and humidified prior to making its way into the lower respiratory system, which helps protect the structures there that are a little bit more delicate. And those structures include the nose. So here, your nasal cavity, which is all of this here. Sinuses, we'll talk about sinuses. There's a sinus here and a sinus here. We'll talk about what those sinuses are, what they're lined with, and why they're there. And your pharynx, which is your throat. And this whole structure here, from about here, this section here, all the way down to here is your pharynx, or your throat. And the job of this, we talked about some major functions of the upper respiratory system, but another major function is to move air. So these are conducting airways. They just move air, conduct air into the lower respiratory system where gas exchange can occur. So in the lower respiratory system, the upper respiratory system warms, filters, humidifies air as it makes its way into the lower respiratory system. And then once it reaches the lower respiratory system, all the way down to the smallest structures called alveoli, each one of these little tiny balls is an alveolus. So collectively they make up what's called an alveolar sac we'll talk about. So the smallest airways are where gas exchange occurs. And all of the function of the upper respiratory system is to just get air filter it, warm it, humidify it, and conduct that air all the way into those lower respiratory system structures called alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. And the structures of the lower respiratory system include the larynx here, your voice box, the trachea, which is also your windpipe, and the trachea then divides into bronchi, or one is a bronchus, and then smaller and smaller and smaller divisions called bronchioles, and then bronchioles eventually divide, branch into the smallest structures that are alveoli. And the respiratory tract is also divided into two different types of passageways. There are some passageways that carry air, transport air, or conduct it to and from the gas exchange surfaces. Those are called conducting airways. And the conducting portion of the respiratory system is everything except for alveoli and the very smallest bronchioles. So all of the airways, the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, all of those structures, basically from the nasal cavity all the way to the smallest bronchioles, conduct air to the exchange surfaces. And where respiration occurs, respiration is gas exchange, is called the respiratory portion, which are the smallest bronchioles that have some alveoli located on those bronchioles and the alveoli themselves. And that's where gas exchange occurs, where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged across very thin membranes. The respiratory mucosa is a layer of epithelial tissue with some connective tissue below it, deep to it. And that mucosa that lines the nasal cavity and the pharynx and the larynx and the trachea, that mucosa helps warm air as it makes its way into the lower respiratory tract, because there's a network of blood vessels that radiate basically heat into the nasal cavity. And it moistens, everybody's favorite word, by way of mucus glands that secrete mucus and then can add humidity, some kind of water vapor to the air as you breathe it in, but also protect it and prevent the delicate structures of the lower respiratory surfaces from drying out. So this respiratory mucosa is a layer of mucosal tissue, which is a layer of epithelial tissue, again, connected to or anchored to connective tissue below it, that helps warm and humidify the air as it makes its way into the lower respiratory system. And this is what it looks like. So it's a layer of pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelia. So this is epithelial tissue we talked about way back when in the first unit of class. And there's mucus cells that secrete mucus to this surface superficial layer here. So this would be like the passageway through the trachea or through the larynx. I think that's where it is showing you into the trachea here. So the trachea is lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia, which is the epithelial tissue here. And there's a layer of connective tissue deep to that the epithelial tissue is anchored to. It's called the lamina propria. We'll talk about this layer quite a bit as we get into other tracts as well. And then those mucus cells secrete mucus, and mucus, basically as you breathe air into the respiratory system, mucus traps any debris and pathogens in that mucus. And then as you breathe, the cilia that line those little hair-like projections that line the columnar cells basically wave the mucus up the respiratory tract so you can clear out any debris and infection or pathogens before they get into the lower respiratory system and can cause infection. A disease that affects the respiratory mucosa, that layer we just talked about, it's an inherited disease called cystic fibrosis. And basically that results in a production of really thick and sticky mucus. So you overproduce mucus, and that mucus is extremely thick. And that can actually restrict airflow and increase the likelihood that respiratory infections can occur and then can damage the respiratory system. There is no cure for this disease, but you can treat it with chest compression therapy, but also breathing treatments that can temporarily thin out the mucus. Remember, mucus, its job is to trap pathogens and cell debris before it gets into the lower respiratory system. But if you're overproducing that mucus, it's harder to get it out of the respiratory system, and it's easier to make its way it makes it easier to make its way into the lower respiratory system where it can get trapped. If it gets trapped, it does a couple of things. It restricts airflow, so it makes it harder for you to breathe, and also can clog the airways where gas exchange occurs, the respiratory airways like the alveoli, and then it can cause infection by basically trapping those pathogens where you can't clear them from the respiratory system. So if you're trapping pathogens there, infection can occur. And then if infection occurs, you get inflammation and you can cause damage to the respiratory membranes that are really delicate. And it can cause the buildup of scar tissue, which causes fibrosis in the lungs, which makes it harder for your lungs to expand. And this disease is just a nasty progression into basically making it very difficult to breathe, to expand and recoil lungs. And the lungs are really elastic tissue. So this can be a really debilitating and even deadly disease. So what we're going to do now is talk about the respiratory system from the point where air is breathed in to where gas exchange occurs. So we're going to talk about each of the structures along the upper and lower respiratory tracts and their functions with regard to the major goal of the system, which is to breathe air, move air into and out of the lungs so that gas exchange can occur. And air moves into the nose by way of what's called the external nares, or your nostrils. The nasal cavity is where air heads next, that is formed by the hard palate and soft palate, which is the roof of your mouth. And then the internal nares, and air moves through the nose and nasal cavity between the external and internal nares to the pharynx, which is your throat. And I'll show you a figure of it next, and we'll go through it again. Or you can flip forward to the figure, which is here, and I'll talk about these structures as we go. The pharynx has three sections. The nasopharynx, think that part of the throat that's associated or closely associated with the nasal cavity. So it's between the internal nares and the soft palate, which is the very back of your roof of your mouth. The oropharynx, which is between the soft palate, which is the top of your, kind of the top and posterior portion of your oral cavity, and the base of your tongue. And then the laryngopharynx, think the larynx is your voice box. So it's the area between the base of your tongue or your hyoid bone, and I'll show you that next, and the entrance to the larynx and the esophagus. So let's take a look here. So right here is the nasal cavity. It's separated by the external, it's bookended basically by the external nares, which are your nostrils, the internal nares, which is sort of just an area or a region here that opens up the nasal cavity to the pharynx, which is your throat, the back of your throat. And then here's your palate, hard palate, which is bone, soft palate, which is other tissues we won't talk about. But here's the end of the palate. So this is the posterior side of the palate. So that then designates the end of the nasopharynx, which runs from the palate. Whoops, I'm going to go back. From the internal nares to the palate is your nasopharynx. Your oropharynx, right here's your oral cavity, because right there's your tongue, is from the tip of the palate, soft palate, to kind of the upper portion of the epiglottis here. It says hyoid bone, so right around in this region. I keep clicking that forward, sorry guys. And then the laryngopharynx is where the opening of the larynx is located, but the larynx opens up to the trachea where air moves, and then the esophagus, which is your food tube basically, runs posterior to that. So there's two tubes here. One is your windpipe, your trachea, and one is your esophagus, your food pipe, okay? Air then passes into the larynx as you breathe air in, and you inspire, inhale. And that larynx is your voice box. So it has an opening called the glottis, which is a narrow opening for air to pass. And it's surrounded, the glottis is surrounded by your vocal cords that produce sound as you breathe. And that is the beginning, the larynx is the beginning of your lower respiratory system. And air then heads from the larynx into the trachea. Okay, so right here's your larynx, your voice box, where your glottis is located, and that glottis is surrounded by vocal cords, and vocal cords are what vibrate as air moves past them to produce sound. Air moves into the trachea, which is your windpipe. Air moves through here, and then the trachea terminates here and branches to a right and a left primary bronchus. And the left primary bronchus conducts air into the left lung, and the right primary bronchus conducts air into the right lung, which is exactly what it says on this slide. The bronchi, so their left and right primary bronchus, branch into even smaller tubes called bronchioles. Again, all of these tubes or airways are conducting airways that just conduct or move, transport air into and out of the lungs into the respiratory surfaces where gas exchange occurs. Bronchioles are lined with smooth muscle but have no cartilage, and the sympathetic nervous system is used to bronchodilate that smooth muscle so you can increase the diameter of those airways and increase how much air is breathed in. Bronchoconstriction can also occur, and that smooth muscle will constrict to decrease the size of the airways and let less air in. So take a look at here. This would be a bronchiole. And a bronchiole is lined by a layer of smooth muscle. Right here is columnar epithelium, right, that we talked about, this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia. And then a layer of smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle can constrict and dilate. In asthma, if you have asthma or if you know somebody who's had an asthmatic attack, it's typically an allergic reaction, and it causes severe and extreme bronchoconstriction where this smooth muscle constricts and it decreases the size of this airway, makes it really hard to get air into and out of the lungs. And that can also lead to inflammation. Usually if it's an allergic reaction, there's inflammation nearby, and that can further constrict the airways and even stop airflow. As we head into the lungs, each of the two lungs is divided into lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes, a superior, middle, and inferior lobe. And the left lung has 2, a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. And the left lung only has 2 lobes because the heart sits in the left side of the thoracic cavity, and there has to be space for it. So the left lung has what's called a cardiac notch to make space for the heart. And the lobes, superior, middle, and inferior, or superior and inferior, are divided by fissures. So let's talk about those lobes and fissures. So right here is the left lung. Right there's the cardiac notch, right? So the heart sits right in here. The superior lobe and the inferior lobe of the left lung are divided by an oblique fissure. Is at a horizontal or at an angle, diagonal. And on the right side, the superior lobe is divided by the middle lobe by a horizontal fissure, and the middle lobe is divided by the inferior lobe by an oblique fissure. So there's a right and a left oblique fissure, but there's only a right horizontal fissure. Take a look at this here. You've got the trachea, left primary bronchus headed to the left lung, the right primary bronchus headed to the right lobe, and then you've got a secondary bronchus that goes to each lobe. There's a secondary bronchus, and then there's even tertiary bronchi that continue to branch. So you have branching similar to blood vessels, from like arteries that branch to smaller arteries and arterioles. You have bronchi that branch to bronchioles. And around each lung, there are membranes, just like there were membranes around the heart called the pericardium. The membranes that surround the heart, called the pericardium, are serous membranes. Well, there's another layer of serous membranes that surround the lung, but they're called pleura. And there's a parietal pleura that lines the inner surface of the chest wall, so that lines the chest wall in the thoracic cavity. And then the visceral pleura cover the lungs directly, so they actually attach to the surface of the lungs. And they create a cavity in between them. So right here's the right lung and the left lung. Right here's the visceral, this lining here is the visceral pleura, and that surrounds just one lung. And then as it hits the cavity wall, it becomes the parietal pleura, and that's what actually lines the thoracic cavity, the wall of the thoracic cavity. And in between the two is the pleural cavity. So there's the pleural cavity. It's pointed out over here. That cavity is filled with serous fluid, and that fluid basically protects the lungs, as do these linings, these membranes. But as the lungs expand and recoil, the fluid there helps reduce friction and prevents the lungs themselves from rubbing up against the body cavity and causing damage to the tissue. These little teeny tiny gas exchange surfaces are called alveoli. They're little tiny air sacs that are surrounded by capillaries. And capillaries are the smallest blood vessels that are able to exchange nutrients and gases. So alveoli that can exchange gas, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are surrounded by capillaries that can exchange gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And they cluster together like grapes. And they're surrounded by some elastic fibers that allow for them to expand as air fills those spaces, but also then recoil as air moves out of the lungs and is conducted out. So take a look at it. Primary bronchus, a secondary bronchus that supplies air to each lobe of the lung, and then smaller bronchi until you hit bronchioles with no cartilage. So the cartilage is there to keep the airways open, because otherwise it's just thin layers of connective tissue. But you need less and less and less cartilage as you get smaller and smaller and smaller in these airways. And the bronchioles are what conduct air into the gas exchange surfaces, the respiratory surfaces, which are clusters of alveoli. And each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries and some elastic fibers. Those capillaries are where gas exchange occurs. So this whole structure is called an alveolar sac. It's created by a bunch of alveoli, and it's supplied air by what's called an alveolar duct. So this duct opens up to the alveolar sac where air runs. And these alveoli have this kind of circular ball-like shape because that helps increase the surface area of the lungs of that tissue, so to maximize gas exchange. So blood flow to the lungs, branches of the pulmonary artery, deoxygenated blood, take blood, deoxygenated from the right ventricle that has just pumped blood back they just received blood from the body. That deoxygenated blood from the heart heads to the pulmonary artery and out to the lungs, eventually to the capillary networks that surround alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. So that deoxygenated blood is high in carbon dioxide, which is diffused out of the blood and into the alveoli at the same time as oxygen from the air that you breathed in is being diffused from the alveoli into the capillaries. And then once oxygen makes its way into those capillaries, the capillaries merge back to the heart into the pulmonary veins that collect that oxygenated blood from the capillary networks and send them into the left atria and ventricle. And eventually that left ventricle pumps blood out to the body. So it's sending oxygenated blood out to the body to deliver it to the tissue everywhere it needs to go. That epithelial lining that lines alveoli and basically creates alveoli is simple squamous epithelium. So remember, that's just one layer of squamous cells that are thin and flat. It makes it really easy to exchange gases across that surface. So most of lung tissue is made up of simple squamous epithelium, particularly the alveoli. There's one other thin layer there. And remember that capillaries are also created from mostly just simple squamous epithelium. So you have a layer of alveoli lined with simple squamous epithelium, and then a thin basement membrane that epithelium attaches to. And on the other side, you have another layer of simple squamous epithelium from the capillary. So really thin surfaces to exchange gas. And there's two other types of cells found in the alveoli. One is called a surfactant secreting cell, and surfactant is this oily secretion that basically creates a thin coating in the inner surfaces of the alveoli, and that helps reduce surface tension. Think surface tension is like at where air and a liquid surface come together. There's a level of surface tension. Like if you lay on a swimming pool, on top of water in a swimming pool, that surface tension is what helps you stay on like a floaty in the pool. You don't just sink immediately. So that is it creates tension inside the lungs that basically stimulates them to kind of recoil. So surfactant prevents that to keep alveolar surfaces open and compliant. And then there's another set of cells called alveolar macrophages that can phagocytose debris and particles that could otherwise clog the alveoli and cause infection or prevent gas exchange. So this here is a larger section. So there's squamous cells. This is simple squamous epithelium. And there would be capillaries that would be surrounding those epithelial cells. And there's some macrophages there, or surfactant secreting cells, and there's a macrophage. So this respiratory membrane, the simple squamous epithelium, promotes diffusion of carbon dioxide and oxygen across that respiratory membrane, which is really, really, really thin. Again, it's 3 layers of tissue: alveolar epithelium, simple squamous epithelium. I keep clicking ahead accidentally. The fused basement membrane, so all epithelial tissue is anchored to tissue nearby by a basement membrane, and the basement membrane here is shared by the alveoli, this simple squamous epithelium, and the capillary, another layer of simple squamous epithelium. So take a look here. Right, here's the alveolar surface or space where air is located. There's simple squamous epithelium from the alveoli, a basement membrane that is shared by the simple squamous of the alveoli, and the simple squamous of the capillary. Simple squamous epithelium of the capillary. So as blood makes its way through here, there's a red blood cell. Oxygen can diffuse from this space here in the alveoli into the lumen, right, and into red blood cells, and carbon dioxide can make its way in the opposite direction. So it makes it really easy for gas exchange. And that's it for the first lecture. I will see you in the second one of chapter 14, where we'll finish the chapter.